Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Inka Vat. Taiwan's largest military drills of the year have concluded, but today we're asking whether China could win without fighting by changing the status quo in the Taiwan Strait one step at a time. With me to discuss this are Stephen Tam, International Policy Advisory Group Managing Director, and Huang Kuei-bo, National Chengchi University Associate Professor of Diplomacy. Stephen, Professor Huang, very warm welcome to the show. Since former US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August 2022, Taiwan has experienced an uptick in Chinese intimidation. Let's summarize how things have been changing across the Taiwan Strait. The number of Chinese planes entering Taiwan's air defense zone has jumped more than 60% from January compared to last year. In the past, intrusions focused on Taiwan's southwestern waters. They now surround the entire country. Before, crossings of the median line occurred sparingly to signal Beijing's displeasure. The median line is an unofficial partition that has been observed by both sides for decades. Now, China crosses this line regularly. And most recently in June and July, China flew at least 9 warplanes close to Taiwan's contiguous zone, which lies just 24 nautical miles from Taiwan's territorial baseline. Can Beijing be altering the status quo in the Taiwan Strait one small step at a time? Stephen, if I can come to you first. So before we get into the details, let's establish what we mean by the status quo in the Taiwan Strait.
Well, that's a great question. The short answer to this is that the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait. What we've been seeing over the past years or months, is exactly that China is changing the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait by use of the non-peaceful means, which is exactly change of the status quo. But China has a totally different definition of the status quo. China thinks that this is under the one China principle.
Maybe we'll bring in Professor Huang. Okay, Professor Huang, so just as Stephen mentioned there, if you were to do a Google search, which I did online, then you can see that China has very, very clear messages saying that the status quo is that Taiwan is part of China, as Stephen just mentioned. Now, of course, the status quo is very important because in international relations, very consistently, recently, US and its allies have been using this term in their joint communiques, talking about they're being opposed, as Stephen said, to the unilateral change to the status quo. So what do you think China is doing here by trying to say that Taiwan is part of China and that this is the status quo?
I think since day one of the establishment of the PRC, it has said that Taiwan is part of China. And of course, the China refers to the People's Republic of China. But for Taiwan, the government of the ROC always said that Taiwan belongs to the Republic of China, not the PRC. PRC never rules Taiwan. And of course, for the international community, they know that the jurisdiction of the Chinese mainland is governed by the PRC government, while the jurisdiction of Taiwan, Penghu, Kinmen, Mazu belongs to the government of ROC. This is the fact. So, of course, we have to know, what kind of China are you referring to? But if Beijing said Taiwan is part of the PRC, that never happens, and I hope it will never happen.
So, can we just dig in a little bit deeper? Stephen, you mentioned that the status quo means peace. However, we can also say that it means separate governance of both China and Taiwan on both sides of the strait.
Well, yeah, I think PRC and Taiwan are under separate jurisdictions, no doubt about that, and that is part of the status quo as well. On one hand, we're referring to the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait as status quo, but also the pre-existing current constitutional legal framework that we've been adopting and we've been enjoying, and the way of life, the democracy and the rule of law. I think that is crystal clear, where China has a totally different view in that. China believes that Taiwan is part of China.
And we can see why they're doing that, because if there was a change, then they would simply say, well that is the status quo. Professor Huang, after Nancy Pelosi's visit, PLA officers boasted about eliminating the median line. Now, there's a fear now that the same thing might happen to the contiguous zones. For our viewers, can you tell us about the median line and the contiguous zone?
In the past, the median line in the Taiwan Strait is a political tacit understanding between Taipei and Beijing. Actually, there was no such a straight median line in the strait, but both sides of the strait know that my military vessels should not cross this median line in order to prevent further conflict. However, after Nancy Pelosi's visit, the PLA has eliminated this political median line in the Taiwan Strait, and its military vessels have crossed the median line approaching the contiguous zone of Taiwan. What does the contiguous zone or contiguous water mean? Actually, that is part of the waters adjacent to a state's territorial water.
So very close to Taiwan's own.
And that 12 nautical mile contiguous zone refers to the area where a state or the coastal state can exercise its rights and its defense capability to prevent or to punish the infringements on physical, for example, or agriculture or immigration violations. So it's not part of the territorial water, but it's some water adjacent to the territorial water, which the coastal states can exercise full rights to protect their own national security. So, the defense officers in Taipei have never confirmed that the PLA military vessels have crossed the contiguous zone lines.
I think they just came close.
Yeah, but I think a lot of people have known that that might have happened. So, that would be a very dangerous moment for Taiwan, because from the contiguous zone, and if a missile is fired by the PLA fighters, and within minutes, the missile can reach the sky above the Taipei city, which is the capital now.
Right.
So I think that would cause a greater danger for Taiwan.
Okay, so it's not just encroachment, but it's actual physical danger. Stephen, these maneuvers have been called salami slicing and salami slicing tactics. Can you explain how this works and how they sit below the level of war?
Salami slicing, as you refer to, is really that China has been adopting the gray zone tactics to go step by step.
Let me just read to you one definition of salami tactics. So the practice of using a series of many small actions to produce a much larger action or result that would be difficult or unlawful to perform all at once.
That is also the unilateral change of the status quo, which is the peace and stability of Taiwan Strait. And I think international communities, including the United States, are looking very closely at that as to what China would do next and what's the level of tolerance as we speak.
On that point, so Professor Huang, what China will do next, is it useful for us to look at what China is doing in the South China Sea? Because again, there's another area where they've used grey zone campaign and salami slicing to effectively gain control over those disputed islands.
Maybe I can put that this way. In the South China Sea, I think such salami strategy is more seen on the sea, while in the Taiwan Strait, it's more often seen in the sky. I think more often we see the air fighters or those surveillance planes approaching Taiwan.
Yeah, so it's a little bit more difficult to stop them. So for example, to do stop and search with planes, isn't it?
I'm not saying it's not possible to, it's not impossible to stop them, but in order to stop them, then you are increasing the risk of involving fights or wars with the PLA.
That's a very good point. Yeah, so there's a risk of escalation, which nobody wants. And is it that, Stephen, that keeps allowing China to keep on doing this? Because it is currently below the level of war, as we define it. And if Taiwan was to retaliate or US to step in, then they would be responsible for escalation.
Well, I think that's exactly where we are right now. I think China knows that very well, step by step, and with the view to achieving something that you couldn't or wouldn't want to do it at once. But I think there is a limit. So I think retaliation or the direct response would be something that are risky, but doing nothing is risky as well.
Right.
I think how to strike a balance, I think it's not just Taiwan or not just about Taiwan. I think international communities together would need to have some coordinated effort over that.
Now, in April this year, a record 91 Chinese warplanes were detected around Taiwan in a 24-hour period. It followed President Tsai Ing-wen's meeting in the United States with US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Bing Wang had this report back in April.
China concluded its 3 days of military exercises by sending a record 91 warplanes into areas close to Taiwan. 54 of those warplanes crossed the median line of the Taiwan Strait, which runs between the two nations. The Chinese exercises involved air, land, and sea forces encircling Taiwan, simulating a blockade. China announced the drills after Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen met with U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in California last week. In August last year, then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi met with President Tsai in Taipei, prompting Chinese forces to conduct large-scale exercises around the island. Beijing sees these meetings as Taiwan asserting its independence. China considers Taiwan as part of its own territory, despite the Communist Party never having ruled over Taiwan. Taiwan's foreign minister lambasted China's response to the high-level meetings.
中国在对台湾的这个威胁的情况之下，只会让两岸的距离是越来越遥远，所以中国的这些做法应该要停止了。我们对中国予以强力的谴责。
President Tsai thanked Taiwan's forces and said the country would keep monitoring the situation.
虽然中国的军演告一段落，国军和国安团队仍会持续坚守岗位，捍卫国家。
China also released a short animation simulating attacks on Taiwan on their social media. The video shows missiles fired from land, sea, and air close to Taiwan, with 2 missiles directly hitting the north and south of the island. Taiwan's officials say the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, is using these videos for cognitive warfare.
是一直不断的进行，透过他们的一些影片，对内、对外、对国际的宣传，也可以达到它的效果。这样的一种武吓，当然也会对台湾造成一股混淆视听啊。
Unlike their exercises 8 months ago, the PLA did not actually fire missiles this time. Now that the 3 days of exercises have ended, officials say they expect these incursions and cognitive warfare to continue as China has made it clear it won't stop trying means to intimidate Taiwan.
Professor Huang, so we got a taste there of the magnitude of the intrusions that have now become quite commonplace around Taiwan, and also some of the political warfare that was mentioned by the experts there. So what if an invasion or an attack or a blockade, which is what China's military has been practicing for, maybe, how about if this will never actually happen, and that in fact China is just pulling the wool over our eyes, and they in fact intend to take us through the repeated small actions of grey zone warfare instead, similar to what's been happening in the South China Sea?
We have to admit that the PLA has the almost full capability to engage in the so-called conventional warfare, the gray area warfare, and psychological warfare. So for Taiwan, I think it's of great importance for us to know that Taiwan cannot focus only on one item. We have to have this tri-dimensional warfare plan or strategic planning so that Taiwan can better prepare for the worst scenario, given by the PLA's invasion.
Because the grey zone warfare is happening every single day.
Yeah, like fishing vessels or some coast guards approachment, etc., etc. But that's just part of the potential danger faced by Taiwan. And don't forget, like almost every day, the PLA's fighters or surveillance vessels, etc., are around or near Taiwan. And that is also a major danger that Taiwan has to deal with. Not to mention, as I just mentioned, the psychological defense. We have to tell the people, yes, the way of our living is probably superior to most of the places in mainland China, and the political system we are having is more superior. At least we are enjoying more freedom than the mainland Chinese people. But because of this freedom, it's easier for the Chinese communists to penetrate into Taiwan society and to divide Taiwan society into 2 or 3. So all this we have to take into account so that Taiwan's overall defense can be more effective.
Okay. Stephen, let me quote to you Li Junyi from the Institute for National Defense and Security Research. He says, he categorizes it as China, want to intimidate us, test our capabilities and wear down our defenses, and over time they will strengthen their control over the Taiwan Strait and change its legal status. How do you think they might do that?
I think not just that. The cognitive warfare, making people in Taiwan think that it's inevitable for the unification. Lots of misinformation and disinformation that lots of people here in Taiwan don't even know that they're from China. I think all in all, it's a war. It's close to a war, not just in the military sense, but also trade and economic. I think altogether, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a change of the legal status, because the status, the relationship between Taiwan and China, where the legal status of Taiwan cannot and will not and should not be changed unilaterally by the strategies and tactics that's being used by China.
But China has been gradually basically pushing this, their perspective, which is that Taiwan is legally part of China, to as many countries, as many people as it can. It's been trying to say that the US believes this too, which is also, we know, is not the case.
Right.
Professor Huang, let me bring you in. Critics say the US, which Taiwan, of course, largely aligns with militarily, also focuses on an outright invasion and doesn't focus enough on grey zone warfare. Let's take a look at a bite, and it's from Rupert Hammond Chambers. He's from the US Taiwan Business Council.
The Biden administration, in our view, is focusing on only a D-Day style attack when there are a range of issues that Taiwan has to face in all phases of potential conflict with China. To focus only on one area is to provide the PLA and the Chinese generally with an opportunity to focus on those areas the Biden administration is forcing Taiwan not to focus on.
So we heard there from Rupert that that was basically following the change in US policy in terms of arms policy to Taiwan, where they wanted Taiwan to focus on asymmetric warfare. Now this, of course, is focused on an outright invasion. So do you agree that the US is too much focused on an actual D-Day invasion?
I think it's natural for the US government, for every US government, to focus too much on the conventional warfare or
why is it natural?
Because the US doesn't have to care too much about the gray zone area close to the US continent, right? So, and sometimes, the US allies...
Are you saying that they think it's just Taiwan's problem?
It's allies' problem, not the US own problem.
Oh, let me just add on very quickly. I disagree with Professor Huang to the extent that I think the United States does care that China continues to use non-peaceful means, not necessarily use of force to change the status quo, and that is exactly what you see the most recent legislative bills and passed by the U.S. Congress, and then the dynamic applications of the Taiwan Relations Act. So I think not just the United States, but the international communities they do respond to what we're facing right now.
I think Stephen overread what I just said. I just mentioned the U.S. didn't care too much about the gray zone threat faced by Taiwan, but the U.S. is caring about Taiwan's situation right now.
On that measure, I just want to say that maybe it's true that things are changing. Maybe it's the fact that gray zone tactics it's taken, the US and the international community a while to cotton on to what China's been doing. But, are things changing? The presidential drawdown that was just announced by the Biden administration, $345 million in weapons. Part of that is rumored to contain the MQ-9A reconnaissance drones, and these will actually help in essentially monitoring any gray zone warfare. Also, the National Defense Strategy, the US in 2022 has increased its focus on gray zone methods. It says that these are coercive approaches that may fall below perceived thresholds for US military action, but that we will increasingly focus on this area.
Right.
I had interviewed James Holmes of the US Naval War College, and he spoke about China's insurgency methods in the South China Sea, and he said that the only way to combat that is to adopt counterinsurgency methods. Now, what he meant, he said that this essentially comes down to being present. Let's take a look at what he said to me.
Similarly, we need to figure out ways to get forces, whether it's Navy, Marine, U.S. Coast Guard, regional Coast Guards, out to the scene to actually face down what China has done in the guise of its fishing fleet, its maritime militia, and its Coast Guard. That's the first step towards wisdom, and at that point, we need to devise ways to actually do things once we're on the scene. But you do have to be on the scene to compete.
So both, maybe Professor Huang, we're coming to the end of the show now. Do you think that being present would work in the Taiwan Strait?
I haven't had a chance to speak to some other U.S. experts on that, but to my best understanding, that I think maybe some people in the U.S. are in favor of that, but others will have some concern about that, because if U.S. want to be present all the time, how much money and how many people that will
troops on Taiwan? Yes,
and troops on Taiwan, and not to mention the burden on the U.S. troops in Japan and in Korea will be even greater. And also for ASEAN countries, I don't know whether or not they welcome such a frequently visible U.S. military presence in the South China Sea, for example.
No, we're talking about the Taiwan Strait.
Yes, and Taiwan Strait too, because in the Taiwan, if the U.S. frequent appearance in the Taiwan Strait, which would be seen by the PLA as a technical involvement of the U.S. in the case of the Taiwan Strait.
But the Taiwan Strait is international waters.
There's an international waterway in the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah.
And for Taiwan, I think maybe many Taiwan people will say, hey, that's one of the safeguards given by the U.S. But for Beijing authorities, I think maybe Beijing authorities will take some countermeasures against U.S. So the tension in the Taiwan Strait might be stirred up a little bit.
So you think it would be counterproductive? Stephen, very last.
Just a quick word. I think it's interactive. I think it helps just to talk about it because China is pushing and pushing. Whether or not that the U.S. needs to be quote unquote present.
You mean the threat of being present might be enough?
Right. I mean, it helps. There is a merit just to talk about it.
So this is deterrence in itself.
Exactly. This is the part of deterrence, and it is interactive as we speak. So I think we should continue to talk about that and to generate sensible discussions and debates over that issue, and then it helps.
So put a cost on it. Okay. Well, we are going to have to wrap up. Thank you so much, Stephen and Professor Huang. Hello, I'm Ian Kavat of Taiwan Talks. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Feel free to leave us any feedback in the comments section. See you next time.